Hello and welcome. This podcast is brought to you by Industrial Info Resources. Since 1983, we have been providing global market intelligence on the industrial and energy markets, and through the combination of our trusted data, which is validated and qualified direct from source, and our analytics and forecasting tools and solutions, we help our customers stay connected and in tune with the latest project and investment opportunities and those trends that are occurring across the world. My name is Shaheen Chohan. I am the Vice President of Global Analytics at Industrial Info Resources, and I'm based in our Dubai office. And I've been with the company now for about 15 years. Now, today, to help unveil some of the trends we are seeing from our global research, I am delighted to introduce Trey Hamblet, who is our Global Senior Vice President of Chemical Processing Research. Welcome, Trey. Now, Trey, when we came into the beginning of the year, you were already anticipating a pretty interesting outlook for the next 12 months. Now, the chemical industry in particular sits, I guess, very close to the end consumer. And so any kind of, I guess, shift in sentiment or demand or even, the economic outlook can probably have quite a sizable near-term impact on chemical producers' confidence. And I remember when you and I used to have, when we were talking and we were looking at the outlook during COVID, that peak of COVID, even though there was some short-term erosion in consumption, the reality is long-term demand fundamentals were still pretty robust. So looking at the current situation that we're in at the moment, albeit a little bit of uncertainty, certainly some change afoot, would you say that there is still a high degree of confidence in the industry, certainly over the mid to long term?
Certainly, you're correct. The industry is considered very consumer-concentric, right? It follows the pattern of GDP and consumer confidence and those items. And yes, the world population estimates continue to grow. With that comes the demand for plastics, comes for the demand of all the things that we as consumers require, and the elevation of those societies in other parts of the world that are still advancing with, first-time phone buyers, first-time automotive purchasers, et cetera. So the long-term outlook remains the same. And you're absolutely correct in that, some of the dilemmas that we're starting with early in this year are creating some confusion, concern, and worries, but we don't anticipate that hampering long-term, even really mid-term chemical industry spend, where we've seen some announced delays on previously funded, permitted projects this year so far in recent days and weeks, but we do anticipate those will be short-term impacts.
So just honing in on some of those short-term impacts, and clearly, everything's being defined by, aren't we seeing various levels of tariffs, and if so, on whom? So do you think that the tariff situation, if it continues, and I know that we've got a kind of a 90-day pause on these, but if we see some of those tariffs move forward, do you think that would actually impact the profitability of not just operational chemical producers, and do you think this could cause some of them to potentially hold back? Certainly those projects, those producers who are sitting with certainly those expansion type projects, do you think we may see some of those get held back and folks kind of sit on their hands a little bit for a good part of this year?
The answer is yes. I mean, we've seen that already. We've seen an evidence of that already. We've seen it in several of the very large, billion-dollar plus projects. And while it's related to tariffs, it's really more related to the material cost of these construction projects, as well as how does it impact margins down the road? Again, the long-term economics are quite strong, but they're going to change. Those pictures are going to change with tariffs, and because the chemical industry is, as we mentioned earlier, so tied to the consumer, the cost of those materials as they make it all the way through the production and manufacturing food chain will impact the margins and certainly challenge the decisions for some of those projects.
Right. So your team of global researchers who are making direct calls and surveys with both plant operators and project owners, and your guys are doing this on a daily basis. Are any of them starting to see kind of slippage in some of those start dates, or indeed, have we seen any fallout, or is everything still holding firm?
Specifically, some of the very large carbon capture projects. We've got some of the green and blue initiatives that we really anticipated we'd see a second quarter 2025, maybe even a third quarter of this year construction start. We've seen a lot of those, and I say a lot, a half a dozen or more, that I can think of, tangibly, that we've seen evidence of us following back up with the EPCs or the owners trying to check on a construction start, and they've said, we're now moving this 6 months out, we're moving this 9 months out. We need to see how the first half of this year unfolds before we make a firm decision on what we had already previously committed to. So we've certainly seen the timeline for starts tangibly move. But again, similar to our outlook maybe a year or 2 years ago, we have a huge accumulation of projects because we haven't seen a mass exodus to cancel projects, right? It's been more about, let's move it to the right, to the points we've made earlier about long-term demand. Global population growth, global demand continues to be very strong, particularly when you look at the U.S. and you look at the cost advantage that we have on our very, very cheap energy feedstocks. We have an increasing capacity of NGLs becoming available, which are very opportunistic to the petrochemical industry, as well as those commodities being exported by themselves. But we have a very structured, long-term, low-cost feedstock for the petrochemical industry, and that's going to be something that we...
And you always use the oil to gas ratio. When you say cost advantage, what are you typically looking at as that ratio of that oil to gas?
Yeah, so if you think back to when the shale gas evolution began back in the 2013, 2014 period, most of the big producers were saying we needed a 7-to-1 ratio. We were already at a 14 or 15-to-1 ratio, and then you go through the latter years of that, and we were at a 25, 30-to-1 ratio, right? And so even though crude oil prices are expected to continue to plateau, if not fall, over the next 12 to 18 months.
I mean, I was looking at some forecasts only this week, actually, that, many of those forecasts are kind of, and there's a range, but they're sort of putting the ballpark roughly, both for Brent and WTI, that it could be around $65 per barrel this year, but possibly fall to maybe the high 50s for 2026, so into next year. Right. So do you think if at those levels, if we do see a softening crude price, that may erode some of the US cost advantage and pass some of that advantage over to those Asian naphtha-based producers?
It's an incredibly complex picture because you have the LNG capacity that's coming online, a massive amount of it, doubling of that capacity between now and 2028. In tandem with that, you have, I think there's something like 35 or 40 NGL processing trains coming online, which again produces a tremendous amount of the ethane that we need for that cost advantage. So as long as our cost advantage for the NGLs remains incredibly cheap, which it's forecast to do. I think there were 50-something NGL trains brought online in the last 3 years, another 35 coming in the next 2 years. That just continues to support the fact that we're going to have the availability of a low-cost feedstock. Because to your point, in Asia, they're still predominantly consuming naphtha, and when they're consuming ethane and those other NGLs, a lot of times it's an imported product from the U.S., right?
Right.
So crude oil, to your point, to try to capture the answer you're looking for, crude oil falls into the mid-50s. That oil to gas ratio is going to fall, but it's still well above what U.S. producers need to have a positive margin. Right.
And I guess also another kind of tailwind for U.S. producers is obviously the Trump administration, very pro-hydrocarbon. And, really pushing for the development and the reshoring of domestic manufacturing. So this sort of push for more upstream supply from a feedstock perspective, but then also building out the domestic manufacturing sector, that must paint a very rosy, positive picture if you're a U.S. chemical producer, right?
Yeah, well, so much of the spending that we're tracking in the chemical industry right now is around that theme of blue and green commodities. And the IRA incentives that came out in 2022 play a huge picture in that. There's some enormous spending planned on the horizon for blue methanol, blue hydrogen, blue and green hydrogen, methanol, ammonia, et cetera. There's been concerns that the current administration is going to pull back or repeal some of those IRA dollars, that it's going to influence that. But so far, we haven't seen any tangible evidence of that. We've seen the rhetoric towards that, slow some and continue to gain some momentum. There's several projects on the slide that we have in front of us that shows some of the highest likelihood and highest probable projects. You think about it, you have a very traditional, going back to that natural gas feedstock, you have a very traditional technology, the SMRs, the reformers, et cetera, with a structural feedstock that is very well intact and there's a good infrastructure for here that's very inexpensive. And then as a producer, you get paid for the CO2 on the back end.
Right.
You've got almost a super commodity in comparison to the rest of the globe, right? Because you've got a very cost advantage feedstock. Mm-hmm. You're getting paid on the back end on a commodity that already has a globally advantaged cost factor.
Right. Now, interesting, I do want to stay with some of these clean commodities. It's always the green hydrogen that kind of gets the attention. And that's probably one part of the market that maybe we see some slowdown. But you're very, very positive. I remember when we were having a chat very recently, you said you think a lot more momentum will be coming from the blue hydrogen and then subsequently those downstream blue commodities as well. Could you just, for folks who are tuning in, just explain the difference between green versus blue commodities from a chemical perspective?
Certainly. I mean, it's obviously the same molecule. It's the same commodity, has the same chemistry, flash points, and all those combustion points, et cetera. But the green commodity is originating from that renewable power, which we have a significant challenge because the data center construction is just enormous. We need all the power we can get to support those. Everybody's in the need of power. The challenge for the green commodity is access to the renewable power to produce it, but then also it has, despite it being the same chemistry, the same molecule, it has to be transported separately to be able to carry that green flag. It has to be consumed separately to carry that green flag, and we don't have the infrastructure to carry out that life cycle of that commodity. And to your point, yes, there's been a lot of hype around the green hydrogen commodity over the last 3 to 5 years, and of the tens of billions that we've seen identified planned for green hydrogen, we've only at this moment have 9 operational commercial scale green hydrogen units across the entire U.S.
Right.
So hundreds of projects, tens of billions. We've materialized 9 units. That kind of tells you there's a bit of a challenge to overcome that hurdle. And into the question you asked about blue, yes, we very much anticipate we're going to see more of the blue, whether it be Air Products in their Darrow project, Linde in their project, OCI in Beaumont. But again, it's to that point we talked about earlier. They're getting some very significant credits to capture that CO2. There's a very tangible incentive, financial incentive behind those, and they're commodities that feed other chemical commodities. So that cost advantage is getting carried through the rest of the food chain. It takes chemicals to make chemicals. So if we can put it blue hydrogen, blue methanol, blue ammonia into the market, everyone who consumes it downstream gets to carry a part of that ESG flag.
Right, right. Now, in a sense, the US is kind of playing catch up when it comes to certainly the green and blue hydrogen market. I mean, successfully caught up. Where else in the world, if you could, put your finger on where some of the other hotspots are in terms of capex, as well as operational capacity out there for the green and blue commodities?
Yeah, so Europe has made some significant advancements on the green hydrogen, certainly at a greater pace than we have here. I think that's largely tagged to the fact that they don't have that natural gas cost advantage that we have to get through to traditional hydrogen the way that we do. And so Europe has certainly advanced, and there's a tremendous number of green hydrogen projects planned across even Oceania, Latin America, et cetera. We haven't seen those materially advance in any great numbers yet, but yes, to your point, there's been other regions of the world that have reached for green hydrogen to be their solution, and probably the most successful region so far has been Europe.
So just focusing very quickly on Europe, is it more towards the green side, bearing in mind they've got a very well entrenched
very much so.
power side, rather than the blue side? Okay.
Very much so.
That's great. So Trey, just in summary, I guess it's probably fair to say that your researchers are still pretty confident about the mid to long-term outlook for the chemicals market. So in conclusion, could you just kind of summarize some of the particular trending sectors or indeed geographies, certainly for this year, that you want to make sure that folks who've tuned in and some of your customers make sure that they pay attention to?
So for the balance of 2025, I mean, we're going to keep a very close watch on any significant challenges domestically to the IRA dollars and the things that are going to potentially hamper some of the carbon capture, because if you look at the individual list of the biggest projects, they all have some sort of blue or green component to it. So if you look at what's really trending, that's what people are watching the most, right? When you get outside of that, there are other themes. There's advanced plastic recycling that continues to advance, and there's a significant amount of spend for that, particularly in Europe as well. It's moved significantly here in the U.S. You have domestic firms in the U.S. that are spending billions of dollars in advanced plastic recycling in Europe. So there are other themes and other trends domestically that happens to be the largest. Ag chemicals, even ammonia. There's a very big thirst for ammonia in Europe being imported from the U.S. But then when that ammonia lands on the shores in Europe, converting that to other downstream commodities. So that's a sector to watch quite closely. Those are the couple that kind of top my radar as I think about the year as a whole.
Great. Well, Trey, as always, I really enjoy the conversation when we do get that time together. That brings us to the conclusion of today's podcast. Thanks, Trey, for sharing your insights and perspectives today. And thanks to everybody who's joined us. If you have any questions, then please do reach out to either myself or Trey on the contact details you can see here. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion as much as I have, and I hope we have helped you all better navigate some of the currents of change that we're seeing today. Thank you.